So we're going to move to the next presentation, and this is about system leadership, finding possibility and purpose through data. And this is going to be led by Joanne Pitman, who most of you know. Just a bit about Joanne. Joanne's career has focused on intentional practice, developing and leading effective collaborative teams, and the use of school and system evidence to support a responsive learning environment. In this presentation, Joanne will be taking us through an interactive session where we will be exploring several considerations that needs to be taken at the leadership level pertaining to data use across a complex system. She will be identifying key structures and processes needed as we consider the assumptions we make about the data to create possibility and drive action focused on student success. Please welcome Joanne.
Thank you, Thomas. Well, good morning again, everybody. And now that you've all got some food and refreshment, if you're compelled and you know the educator in you says, but what if they take it away before she's done? Feel free to go back out and get some more. I will take no offense. I understand this burning desire when you've got quality snacks outside the door. Thank you, Doug, for your presentation, and as always, and I had the privilege of meeting Doug quite a number of years ago, and that was when I was actually working up in Grand Prairie, and since then we've kind of had this opportunity to engage in different thinking and certainly challenge one another, him more than, I don't know. I always feel like if you read his biography, because he has a Wikipedia page, that's a different level. And so I always kind of defer a little bit, but I really appreciate, Doug, how you've framed out some thinking. And my goal with this portion of the day is to invite you in to consider system. So regardless of your role currently, and I know we have a range, whether you're a school principal or a system leader currently, or you're in a specialist position and you're thinking system, I want you to consider what that means. What is the system in which you work? So for those of you who are thinking about this and you're a school administrator, your system is your school. You also work within a system, and so there's another level there. In the context of a system leadership component, what I'm really holding is the incredible opportunity to take system to student and student to system in a way that addresses educational prosperity of what Doug spoke about along each of those pathways, and understanding how it is we actually take action within a practical setting. And some of those pragmatic realities that definitely impact and cause us to consider different approaches. Now, Doug and I did not talk explicitly about how we were each going to be starting off our sessions. And there's an interesting picture here. It's not the same. This is not Noah. In fact, I have a story about Adam, because I wanted to take one story, one system, and draw the parallel that we can take big data, tens of thousands of students, hundreds of thousands of students over multiple years, and we can create the conditions to take action that is both responsive, timely, and measured. But before we do that, we have to connect to ourselves. And I often feel like in the role as superintendent within the CBE, and my colleague Andre and I talk about this, there's sometimes, it's always interesting when you meet with people who maybe haven't had as many interactions, and you ask a really specific question, or you make an observation about a specific detail that you know is related to that individual school, and there's always a little bit of shock. How do you know that? And, you know, personally, this is the thing. We all got into this work for the same reasons. What I get to think about in my daily work is different, but exactly the same goals. And so it's important to be able to ground back to one story, one system, and consider where is their alignment, Where's their dissonance, and how might we move forward? So if you'll indulge me a little bit, I have a story. And this is a true story. It is a personal one for me because I was the principal in this story. And so it's a really important element that has driven me in all of my action. It happened again. And it's only the second week of September. The principal's called to the grade 5 classroom to intervene with Adam. The class is working on math, and Adam, curled under his desk, is alternating between yelling, "This sucks, I hate you all," and making highly disruptive noises. He then begins throwing bits of eraser from underneath his desk at students and telling them, "You're all wasting your time. This teacher doesn't even know what she's talking about." And despite the principal's redirection in their positive relationship, Adam continues. The teacher directs the remainder of the class to relocate, to continue their work, and the principal remains behind. This is the 4th time in 5 school days that the principal, new to the school, has had to intervene. Adam has been on and off medication to address a diagnosis of ADHD. And because Adam and his family have moved to Alberta from Eastern Canada 2 years prior, he has not had a regular family doctor. And while the school has accessed mental health supports in the previous year, he's only been seen a handful of times, and he's lost. The school is in the process of arranging for an educational psychological assessment, but due to competing student needs, that is not going to occur for quite some time. Each day, Adam is escalating in his frustration at school with his peers and his willingness to engage with any adult. His academic skills have suffered greatly. He already entered in reading at a grade 1 reading level. And right now, given where we're at, that's not looking like it's going to improve. Academically, he has virtually disengaged and found out later the previous year had completely disengaged as well. At this point, I would say he's at a high risk of being a non-completer. As Tracy, Adam's mother, sits with Adam in the waiting room to see what will now be the 3rd mental health therapist in as many years, she wonders how she will navigate another round of questions. She is tired, and she feels as though her son is disappearing before her eyes. Every day is a fight to get Adam to school, and he moves between sullen and silent to outwardly aggressive, throwing accusation after accusation towards her. As the latest events at school move through her mind, Tracy feels the anger and helplessness overwhelm her. How can she find the right combination of help for her son? What about her family? Making time for these appointments is hard when she regularly has to find a caregiver for her young daughter who's just 3 years old. The school is working closely with her, but there still seem to be so many barriers. What about the teacher? Well, Jen sees Adam looking despondently at his unopened books. The majority of students have started in on their independent work, focused on the learning intention clearly stated. Everything looks great. But Jen is keenly aware of the many students she needs to check in with individually. Even though she has adapted Adam's assignment to what she knows he is capable of, he has yet to attempt any of the work. She methodically moves about the room, checking in with individual students, hoping to normalize by the time she gets to Adam, he sees he's not singled out again. As she approaches his desk, he starts tapping his pencil. Within seconds, he whirls around and glares at her. "I'm not touching this stupid work. I don't care what help you say you want to give me." She slowly kneels beside his desk so she is at eye level, ready to remind Adam that he has 10 minutes of this focused work before his preferred activity and an opportunity to take a break. Instead, Adam rolls out of his desk and starts making random noises. Jen again restates the expectation and asks him where else he might like to move to finish his work or what else she might do. Adam refuses to respond and kicks out at her from under his desk. Jen addresses the class to continue their work, as they know, once again, there will be disruption. As Adam continues to escalate, Jen calls down to the principal for support. As I share this story, student, teacher, parent, I want to start off by stating my belief is that system data, led well, and with the necessary structures and processes, can see this student, can impact this teacher. But to do so requires us to have an understanding of what is the data we are looking at, who is in the room, and over time, what are the key actions built out, measured, that we can take to impact. When I came to the CBE in 2019, my primary reason, and I was actually asked why, prior to starting today, why did you come to the CBE? Well, first of all, they hired me, so that's a good thing. But the primary reason why I actually moved away and lived apart from my family for 2 years to move to this organization was because I know that it does not matter the size of an organization. I have worked in small, now in large, that the conditions to be responsive, the barrier is not size. It is not. It's different, but it's not a barrier. And I couldn't look away from the opportunity to consider how can you take a level of incredible diversity, long history, sometimes controversy, and bring that together with exceptional educators, exceptional support staff, and take action. And so regardless of size, so whether you're thinking about this from a school or you're thinking about this from a system, we're going to walk through and I'm going to ask you to explore a little bit some of your assumptions relative to each of those things. So I'd like you to just take a little moment here, and I'm going to ask you to reflect on your response to each of the statements in your current role. You can do that individually, you can do that at your table if you're comfortable doing so, but I'd like you to think about how do you respond to some of these statements relative to data. So data is defined by numbers. Take a moment, think. Is that at your core? When you think data, data is defined by numbers. I started off with an easy one, FYI. Okay, I'm going to move us along. Data is best utilized at identified points in the year. Remembering, I'm not leading you down any path here. I am just putting some pieces out for your consideration. Truly, some of you think I have an evil plan, which is usually the case, but not today. Today, it's just me. No evil plans to be brought forward. So data is best utilized at identified points in the year. Think about what is your experience with that? How has that worked for you? Why might that be important? Why might not that be important? Notice not as much chatter on this one. All right, next one. When has this statement been true for you? Data is limiting and a distraction from the real issues. Think my teacher Jen and her experience with Adam. And that, let's just say that happened on a Friday where the rest of the afternoon was going to be focused on data. So, just a little consideration. Go ahead, when has this been true for you? And when has it not been? All right, I'll bring you back. I gave you a little extra there because you were slow going. All right, systemic school and student level data processes are interrelated. Systemic school and student level data processes are interrelated. When has this been your experience? Is this your experience? Is it not? And how did you get there? Okay, I'll bring you back. Now, I could have placed many other statements. I have many other thoughts on assumptions that we can make about data. And I've been really enjoying some early morning podcasts to kind of broaden my thinking in different areas. And recently was listening to a podcast with Adam Grant, and he was interviewing or speaking with a data scientist, Andrea Jones-Roy. And she made a really interesting comment that I thought was intriguing from an educational perspective, and I deferring to Doug's broad and detailed research and analysis of huge data relative to PISA and work with the OECD, all of these pieces. And it's always intriguing, when different data sets are released into the public. What the podcast is really about is this discussion of how, when we do these studies, there's always the executive summary that talks about the conclusion. The methodology is way down here. And as a data scientist, she was commenting on how that frustrated her because people first decide if they agree with the outcome, and if they don't, then they go after methodology, versus going, no, I can accept this methodology and then find the outcome. And it was funny, and this is how my brain works, and this is not part of the presentation, but as the Bloom's quote around, creativity. Mastery begets creativity. And then that got me thinking about all the conspiracy theories that I think are quite creative, and I wonder if we would comment on if they had mastery or not. And then that was a completely different rabbit hole that my brain moved down during this morning. But as I was considering data and how we view studies, and when we think about methodology, Andrea Jones-Roy, her comment was, cynicism is not the same as critical thinking. And that challenged me a little bit because I immediately had to check some assumptions of where I've come across various studies where I asked myself, did you come at that with critical thinking? And if so, what mastery would I need to have in terms of my knowledge to be able to analyze, consider, disagree, pose alternate solutions? And where am I simply a cynic? And I think that's something that at this point in time in our lives, and given the very detailed level of focus, education, regardless of in whichever environment is part of, that we really have to ask ourselves in this fishbowl, challenge ourselves some of those questions. And we have to be able to respond to them as well. And that takes some exploration as we move forward. So think about these assumptions, and as I go through some different pieces that talk about system, I'd like you to ask yourself and be willing to go, where am I taking action, and where am I deliberately choosing not to? Where am I prioritizing that? And where am I going, yeah, but that's just data? And how might we reframe that? So I love data, and I love numbers, and I love questions. My mom would probably really attest to this, that I was always the person asking questions, and she would frequently think that I should refine them before they came out of my mouth. But this is a piece that just comes with you from childhood. This particular book by Warren Berger, A More Beautiful Question, is a really key part of what also is another piece to, different than the technical analysis of data, really delves into some of the mindset that we might engage in. And it's not an educational based book. It's based on broader application. So people might start out asking, how can we do that? How should we do that? But as soon as you start using words like can and should, you're implying judgment. So there's a cynicism that can quickly come with can and should. By substituting the word might, you're able to defer judgment, which helps people to create options more freely and opens up more possibility. What I'm positioning for you right now is this opportunity to take data, a certainty, and insert might, a possibility. And when we take these two constructs, put them together, how might we then move forward? And I'll go back to what my title was, using data to create possibility and purposeful action. So moving on to action, how is it that we move to action? And I would offer that given the pressures we face on every given day, and for those of you coming out of the school setting right now, you've appreciated a chance to slow down. You're still obsessively checking your phone to see if the sub actually did show up, and wondering which parent phone call you're going to need to make. There is discipline in creating this space. As a school leader and as a system leader, there is discipline with creating the space to live with a question, to be able to manage those who are asking and saying, I want answers now, and being responsive to that, and living with a question. So this whole concept of allowing a question to marinate. Now, yesterday I was answering questions in the public boardroom. There's no room for marination, okay? Answer now. And that's just fine. But considering the larger systemic moves that an organization needs to make, we need to be disciplined as individuals and as teams. How is it that we are allowing ourselves to sit and live with a question, coming up with fresh insights that can create possibility? There's always a tension between, I've had an opportunity to meet incredible thinkers, and they have appropriately chosen a career that allows them to think all day long, and it is a gift they give to others. And I don't have judgment for that, but I always want to bring that over into, okay, you can think for so long before you need to act, because there are people like Adam who are saying, I can't wait, and I should not have to wait, nor should his mom. And so it is that as I talk about creating discipline to marinate with possibility, there is the pragmatic element of generating action. And as I spoke in the land acknowledgement, when we think about truth and reconciliation, what are the compelling actions? Not hypothetical, theoretical considerations of challenge. We need to do personal work, and we need to do systemic work. And that needs to be evidenced every single day. I was really struggling with what I might put on the background of this slide to represent ecosystem. I went back into grade 8 science. No, that wasn't really doing it for me. So I decided to take a photo of mine that reflected incredible difference in smells. So this is actually in downtown Toronto, in their brick district, and our oldest daughter was a teacher in an outdoor school there last year, and what an experience that was. They were literally outside every day of the year, and I mean teaching class time, not just recess. But the ecosystem surrounding her was rich and varied, and so many elements for her to consider. And you're constantly taking in information. If the role of data, which my premise is to empower action, the very next question that comes right up against it is, what is the ecosystem we might design purposefully to ensure it does so? So this goes back to my earlier, the check your assumptions piece that asked, we look at data at key points in the year. Okay, so that particular assumption is associated with an ecosystem. There is a design element around what we train and expect people to do. I don't know if there's anybody else like me, but I did, I remember getting grade 9 PAT results. We literally were creating stem and leaf plot charts. And then you get out your highlighter, and were we 5% above the province, 5% below, blah, blah, blah. You get lost in the weeds. You're stuck down some random. Next thing you're doing is debating whether that outcome is actually a priority outcome and should you be addressing it? How are we going to make this meaningful? That was not a great ecosystem. It didn't promote purposeful action. It certainly allowed for some rigorous discussion, but not purposeful action driven to the larger picture. And as a system, we really need to consider our ecosystem. So I'll explore that a little bit further. Before I do so, though, this is, and for individuals who have worked with me a fair bit, you will often hear me use the word precise. Precision in our actions matters. We have a responsibility to be precise. Precise is not at the expense of a holistic view. So when Doug references the number of specific outcomes that are precisely, most critically important, that precision matters. Because we're able to map out what that's going to look like leading up into the future. We have a responsibility to be able to be precise. But that precision, focused solely on very specific, discrete skills relative to learning to read, is not, and at the end, as Doug spoke about well-being, at the expense of the whole. And so as leaders, your responsibility, my responsibility, is to be able to take that precision and balance it with the whole and move between that continually. As you think about your own individual experiences, I'm going to pause for a moment and ask you to think, where have you been precise in your response to data? And how did that go? And how do you know? Where have you been precise in your action or response to data? How did that go? And how do you know? Give you some time to talk about that. All right, I'll bring you back. So hopefully, as you listened to your colleagues, new friends, or longtime people you have sat at tables with, you've been able to just very briefly dip your toe into this construct of precision and the whole. And I'm going to move now a little bit from the abstract discussion to more concrete examples. So for those of you who are from CBE, you should be familiar with each of these categories. They are not new, and they are strongly outlined through the School Development Plan Toolkit support as you review your data. However, I'd like to offer all of you an opportunity to really think about these common questions and how you apply them when we think about categories and we think about the whole. So our demographic data, meaning who are we, our perception data, what do we know about the student learning experience, sense of belonging, if you will. What is the student learning data? How are our students doing? And our system school process data. How do we work? I might actually add another piece to that last one and ask, who is doing the work? Because, and the reason why I raise that is we have the greatest amount of new administrators in our system than we have historically ever had. If we are not, as a system, specifically planning for that and accounting for that, we will misstep collectively. When we talk about, or when you think about your school, and we've all come through the experience of significant staff absenteeism, staff leaves, inconsistent coverage, inconsistent attendance, really impacting who is in the room. So that will be of critical importance as we move forward. The next series of slides outline examples of what it is we use for the CBE relative to each of these pieces. In that particular context, there are many elements to understand. And when Doug spoke about cohort and period data and understanding that, we're really, as a system, trying to get to a different place. So we have now a common data dashboard, updated twice a year, outlining core data sets, many of them reflected on the next series of slides. However, the bigger question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is the ecosystem that's set in? How is it that we are understanding that over time? And how might we apply our understanding of the most recent 2 years in looking at our data differently? And what are our expectations relative to the outcomes? When we talk about perception data, of course, we have our Alberta Education Assurance Measure data, our student survey data, which includes our school, a CBE student survey data, and also then we know that schools engage in individual, I'll say, pulse checks at different points as well. There's also an interesting piece, and this is not systemic, but I do believe this one is important, staff perception data of practice. So by that I mean, what is the staff perception of their practice in this? Staff perception really matters, and understanding what impacts that staff perception is important. And so from a systems perspective or from a school perspective, equally as important, something we have to consider a little differently right now. Student learning data, how are our students doing? So when we think about these, you see a range of diagnostic assessments. I want to highlight that. So Doug referenced blunt measures. We're talking about incremental local measures. And as we think about local measures, local to your school, local to the system, how is it that we can use those measures to look at incremental progress over time? Our system and school process data kind of speaks to the ecosystem a little more broadly. And in that particular context, I've outlined some shifts. I would say the ecosystem within our organization has really shifted specific to attendance. Systemically, attendance hasn't been raised as this primary understanding of what is the impact of it. That is a shift over the last year specifically. And it is a necessary one as we look to attendance being a key indicator of so many other pieces. You take attendance, sense of belonging, and reading. And right there, you've got some fairly precise action. So in an attempt to pull some other pieces together here, what I'd like to highlight for you is our board priorities are achievement, equity, and well-being. If I break that out into literacy, achievement, and well-being specifically, what I'm mapping out by the various connected parts, so literacy, we use the early years evaluation, reading readiness screening tool, and then through Alberta Education, the LENS and CC3. Regardless of your view of the efficacy of any of the instruments, they in and of themselves provide a very clear prediction of where our students are at specific to early reading skills, and should drive our system in making determination around upcoming supports and shifts that may be needed. When we look at report card, PATs, and diplomas, the more blunt measures, they provide a guide. And what I would share is if you've looked at any of our reports, if you're internal, you would note that the reading decline and the kind of challenge that was identified on Doug's slide is also reflected in our results. And so as we consider both that particular graphic alongside the period effect of COVID, how now? On the two outsides, I have structures and processes. As a system, we are currently prioritizing our data dashboard as a way to normalize the way we enter into data. We have work to do in that area. The one thing that I would highlight, though, and I'm going to go back to an earlier slide, sometimes when we get data, we go, oh, and we need this, and we need this. Oh, can you also give me that? Here's my question to you. Are any of those things you're asking for going to create more precision in your action? Or is it simply a distraction? What's the threshold by which more data is going to fundamentally change the action you will take? And I often find that people use that actually as a bit of a foil to say, oh, no, well, we can't actually do anything just yet. We need to know more about this here. Really? Do you? How do you know? So we have to consider those elements when we are looking at these pieces. Lastly, the other element from a systems perspective is cross-portfolio collaboration. So across the Calgary Board of Education, we have incredible diversity. It is an amazing place to be. It's also really complex. And sometimes we create more complexity for our schools because we hive everything off. Welcome, principals and assistant principals, to another email from School Improvement from a different group within School Improvement. And what we're attempting to do from our processes so that we can get to action through this data is better collaboration, because the coherence needs to start somewhere else so that you as leaders are able to take that information and act on it with precision. So we're not there yet. That's work we have to do in your feedback. And as you think about the places you lead in other organizations, that's a really important consideration. So how is it that all of these categories, leaders, teachers, and students, can be impacted through the use of the holistic view of student data? You would be fair to challenge me. I don't see families in there, Joe. There's an intentionality behind that. And some of it is being a little bit protectionist. I believe that precision requires us to focus on that which we control and influence. And so it's easy to go down the storytelling route. We need to stay focused on what it is we can do. Because having a savior complex based on your data, having the martyr story based on your data, that doesn't serve anyone. And we have to challenge ourselves with that sometimes as educators. So what I'm going to finish with is plan. In order to create possibility and generate action, planning allows for your structures and processes to actually impact your students. And that is how we can take big data and drive that. That's an area that's a whole different session that I could go into lots of examples about, but I'm going to leave that now. And I'm going to end with one story, one system, taking action. That's what we get to do. So I hope you've had a chance to kind of confront some assumptions, affirm some of the work you're doing, and think about what might be next for you as you think about the different types of data that you engage with every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joanne. You're such a powerhouse. So we'll open the floor now for some questions.
Yeah. So Adam moved back to the East Coast, and that served no one, because in that grade 5 year, because we asked ourselves, given everything that's going on, what do we do? And we reframed his entire academic programming. Adam was reading at a grade 1 level at the beginning of grade 5. At the end of his grade 5 year, he was above grade 3. And that was our goal. Now, that was September to June. September to the beginning of November, there was not 1 ounce of progress in his academic skill. The sole focus was Adam's sense of belonging. That was it. That was the sole focus, and building trust with his mom. Because fairly, his mom had great distrust of the system. So he was I should have started with a success. What weighs on me is what I know has occurred since. And it's another example of how do we compartmentalize so that we can recreate that? What else does it reinforce? Otherwise, you can kind of get lost over here because Adam is now 19.
Any other questions?
Joanne, what form do you use, looking at practicality services here, in taking a look at staff data and perception and interpretation, not only of their own practice and feeding it to the system, but also taking their ideas, their goals, shall we say, in education, and turning it into action? What form are you using?
So right now, one of the pieces that I highlighted is that the staff perception data of their own practice and their confidence in moving towards addressing pieces is not something that we've got systemically. Schools are certainly utilizing, and I see evidence of this through school development plans where certain schools have prioritized this question of what's the teacher baseline and understanding and how would they assess themselves and what does it look like now? And I think that's really important for a learning organization because while we need to take action, we need to create the conditions for staff to be able to learn. The other element, and I was speaking about this a little bit earlier, the role of the system. So the role of the CBE, as it were, is to create the foundation across every school relative to a baseline of quality that is deserving of every single student across this city. That's the role of system resources. The ecosystem that we must create then allows schools to generate, be innovative, responsive to community. And so what I would offer is that currently and culturally, we always need to understand where our organization is at. And so there's that dissonance of, well, why is the system focusing here? And part of that's communication, part of that's building understanding, and still creating possibility. So for staff to go, so we have our literacy framework specific to very discrete teaching pedagogy. That is a shift for our organization. And that framework is not a 3-year strategy. It is enduring. It's quality practice, period. And our job right now is to continue to see that through year over year, knowing that that focus will have impact. Staff perception relative to that is next step. We do receive feedback through different professional learning or other pieces, but systemically, we're not there yet. Apologize that I don't have a... Lori's first. Yeah.
You win.
I win? Okay. Thanks for sharing that. You mentioned that you have a high number of new school leaders. So what have you done specifically to help bring them along in their use and understanding of data at the school level?
So interestingly, we are in the, I don't know if you know the Sesame Street, you know the two characters who are joined together and then they have this particular shtick that says, I'm in between? That's where we're at. We're in between because we have just this year transitioned from what was a cohort to become or move into a successful position. to an open leadership learning series that's over 18 months, and then candidate pools where you're ready. You're not moving into a professional learning pool. You're ready to move into a position. At the same time, we have historical cohorts that have been for new administrators. So what we're currently doing this year and next year is looking at every single leadership structure. Every time we meet, what is the purpose of that meeting? And what is the structure we're using for the different points in an individual's career? So we've got some new leaders, older leaders, experienced leaders in the room today. And our question has been, which meeting structures are we prioritizing for whom, and how would we know? So we're kind of in that in-between spot right now. What we've also recognized is that impacts how much time we need to spend checking assumptions about the data we're using. We cannot over-assume that an individual school leader fully understands how things have been normed, what this actually means for who's at risk in my building, and how it is they could leverage, say, a tool like the early years evaluation to truly impact high-yield strategies in the classroom over time. So that's our ongoing work right now, and our refined education plan has shown to us that we really need to slow down so that we are not overwhelming that piece. Go ahead, Doug.
So, I'm just going to use reading as an example. There are some districts that still leave principals, schools can measure it, they're free rein to measure it how they want to. There's been a tremendous push to standardize the assessment of reading or early years skill, whatever it is, and that's been consistent over the last 20 years. And the cynical side of that is that the standardization of data and results gives school leaders a chance to hold principals and teachers accountable. But how can you create that system so that, because the advantage of him using the same data as her, that there's better opportunities for shared accountability, and to be able to, how do you create that ecosystem at the school level?
Mm-hmm.
Why? So these guys they're all talking the same language.
Yep.
I guess what I'm saying. How do you create that ecosystem?
Well, I think the creation of that ecosystem starts with the question. Given the graph you just showed during your presentation, and 1 in 3 Canadian students not reading, do we have compelling evidence that a lack of discrete and common understanding of how our students are achieving relative to being readers has been successful? I would say no. And in creating the ecosystem of standardization does not have to mean excessive. There's balance. It does not have to mean time consuming. There is a time element. What's most important is creating the conditions for leaders and staff to take that data and drive the next step. So when it is this esoteric element, something not directly linked to the outcomes that a teacher is focused on and looking to achieve, we have to make sure we're doing a really clear job in expressing these assessments tell us the following elements, and we need to make sure that we're not just assuming people understand what that assessment is telling them. And when we do that, we can create trust, we can allow people to test their assumptions, apply their cynicism to it, and also recognize that when we return to that data, and this is the biggest thing, how many times do you return to the same data set? When you return to that data over time, you are sharing direct feedback to teachers of their impact, not something that somebody else did, their impact. We talk a lot about the impact of teachers, but it is our job as leaders to bring the data to teachers in a way that they can understand and engage in to be able to see their impact. And I believe that's when we actually have system impact and can utilize common assessments so that we're not inefficient. Because there's a great deal of inefficiency with everybody doing their own thing. That is not to say, though, that I think standard assessment practices or standardized assessments should be utilized for everything. There are only for specific elements that we prioritize, such as, can you read? And I think, oh, Darren.
Sorry, one more quick one.
Yeah.
I've been a principal for a long time, and the one thing I've really noticed a change in our system was when we had high-impact strategies linked to our frameworks, and that it was driven by data, but it became a methodology that became system-wide, and I've seen huge growth in our system because of that. Can you speak to how that was employed and if there's next steps in that journey?
So I would say that from a system perspective, and I'm glad to hear that that's been your experience, from a system perspective, that's not everyone's experience yet. And so there is a tension to finding that threshold, because if the system moves on, quote unquote, there's a foundational assumption inherent to that everybody's got it. And the very nature of our staffing cycles means that's always going to be variable. And so that's where I mean, as a system, we have to allow for our focus, and when I say our, I don't mean a the, us, and them element, but systemic resources and time need to ensure that everyone always has access to the foundational instructional development that is required. So if I'm a brand new teacher coming into CBE, what are the structures that are in place that will allow me to engage with that? If the system says, okay, now we're moving on over here, what are we assuming about where everyone else is at? And I think that we haven't cracked that nut entirely. It's certainly something that is very much in play. I would also observe that until we see direct, so if you think about the size of 131,000 students, and you think about the data specific to their reading skill, we need to see direct improvement in that before we make shifts. And that needs to be over time. So that's a significant, the number of students who would need to move from a 3 to a 4 on their report card, or a 2 to a 3 to a proficiency level, would be massive. And we're not there yet. So welcome to a long-term plan.